After the dust had settled from the Second World War, the victorious Allies found themselves with a new war on the horizon, the Cold War. The competition between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union for global influence and control. Each major nation would immediately start developing ways to deliver nuclear weapons faster and farther than their enemies. In the late 1940s, the Soviet Union's sole means of delivering nuclear munitions was the Tupolev Tu-4 strategic bomber. This was an unlicensed copy of the Boeing B-29. However, the piston-engine Tu-4 was growing obsolete very rapidly. The Soviet aircraft industry responded immediately by developing new bomber types. The main competitors for the contracts to build new strategic jet bombers were the Tupolev OKB and the Myasishchev OKB. Tupolev was already very well known in the Soviet aviation industry for his design of the AN-T-20 and the Tu-2. Myasishchev was not as well known within the government and aircraft industry. He himself was a former employee of the Tupolev OKB, and he also worked under Vladimir Petliakov. In 1940, he started working on a design of his own, the DVB-102, which never saw fruition. By early 1951, the choice of jet engines and swept wings for Myasishchev's new bomber had already been decided. On the 24th of March 1951, the Council of Ministers issued Directive Number 949469, ordering the creation of GS-OKB-23, which stands for State All-Union Experimental Design Bureau No. 23, and they appointed Vladimir M. Myasishchev as its head. The directive stated that Myasishchev's OKB was to specialize in long-range heavy bombers, and what was referred to vaguely as a special mission aircraft. The directive further tasked OKB-23 with developing a strategic bomber powered by either 4 AL-5 axial flow turbojets or 4 AM-3 axial flow turbojets. The aircraft was to be capable of covering a 12,000 kilometer distance with a speed of 850 to 900 kilometers an hour, and carrying a maximum ordnance load of 24 tons, which would include individual bombs between 3,000 and 9,000 kilograms. Initially, a handful of designers had to shoulder the main burden of the task. This included Leonid Selyakov, who drew the first sketches of the future 200-ton bomber. He was forced to be a jack of all trades, being responsible for both general arrangement and design, structural strength calculations, aerodynamic design, and strategy development. Myasishchev was busy with major organizational tasks at that time, forming the sections, departments, and teams of the new OKB. The success achieved by MiG-15 fighters in combat against slow and sparsely armed B-29s during the Korean War was given due regard by the Soviet military, which demanded that Myasishchev's bomber would have potent defensive armament. Initially, it would have 4 twin-cannon barbettes. There were many initial drawings to decide the basic features and layout of the aircraft. The eventual final prototype design was called Izdeliye M. I may have mispronounced that, so we'll refer to it as Aircraft M. Aircraft M was packed with new features: the huge swept rings of high aspect ratio, the large fuselage accommodating the crew, remote-controlled cannon barbettes, large bomb bay, the swept tail surfaces, and the bicycle landing gear, which had not been seen on heavy bombers before. On the Aircraft M, the OKB decided to house the engines completely inside the thick wing root section. By thickening this part of the wing, the engineers managed to make it stiffer, which confined aeroelasticity and dynamic wind stability problems. This made it possible to design a relatively lightweight ring structure with a high resistance to flutter and turbulence. The bicycle landing gear proposed by Myasishchev was not exactly new to Soviet aircraft engineers by then. The first Soviet aircraft to have a bicycle undercarriage dated back to 1941, when Igor Chedverikov proposed his IS-1 MLV-37 fighter. The next attempt was undertaken in 1949 when the Central Aircraft Bureau wanted to convert a Tupolev UTB bomber trainer into a bicycle landing gear test bed. The modified UTB was to have a special truss mounted under the fuselage to permit installation of experimental landing gear struts. Although the modified UTB was never built, even though Myasishchev was asked to participate in the development of the testbed at the Central Aircraft Bureau's request. To speed up verification of the bicycle landing gear on a real-life combat aircraft, another designer by the name of Alexeyev offered to convert his I-215 twin-jet multi-role fighter whose takeoff weight was similar to that of the UTB. All the engineers needed to do was install a twin-wheel main gear strut under the center fuselage and small struts beneath the engine nacelles, and eliminate the existing main wheel wells. The tests were so successful that several other design bureaus were able to develop viable combat aircraft with bicycle landing gear. Compared to other landing gear arrangements, the bicycle landing gear was better suited for operation from unpaved airstrips, which might be a necessity even for heavy bombers in wartime conditions. Finally, the bicycle landing gear made it possible to place the bomb bay closer to the center of gravity. In order to test a bicycle landing gear that would be similar in size and weight to that of the real thing, OKB-23 developed a special version of the Tu-4 bomber. Completed in January 1952, this testbed had the in-house designation of the SHR. Stage 1 of the test program lasted from April to June 1952. The SHR made 50 taxiing runs and 34 flights to check stability and handling. A full-scale wooden mock-up was built for finalizing the bomber's internal layout and positioning of specific equipment items. The layout basically followed the one set forth in the directives documents. Outwardly, the mock-up differed from the subsequent first prototype in having flush air intakes. The mock-up was presented to the review of the Commission on the 22nd of October 1951. On the 30th of October, the Commission gave its general approval, signing a protocol which said the mock-up could serve as the basis for the prototype's manufacturing. Also, the OKB built the SM propulsion test rig, which was only a wing section and 2 engines, fuel system, and etc. By the end of 1951, OKB-23 had virtually completed development of its first strategic jet bomber. Next, the OKB started issuing manufacturing drawings for the first prototype. Construction of the first prototype began in early 1952. The specific operational requirement for the Aircraft M bomber was endorsed by the Soviet Air Force Commander-in-Chief on the 23rd of June 1951, and by the Mock-Up Review Commission on the 30th of November 1951. That same month, when preparation of the manufacturing drawings was still in progress, the Myasishchev OKB experimental shop set about manufacturing airframe subassemblies for 2 prototypes and a static test version. The final assembly of the first prototype commenced on the 15th of May that year. At factory number 23, the aircraft received the product code Izdeliye 25, whereas some OKB-23 documents referred to the bomber as the 2M or VM-25. The Air Force, however, allocated the service designation of M4, which the bomber would be best known by. Test crew training and preparation for the M4's first flight was done in parallel with the prototype's construction. The first prototype was rolled out in December of 1952 after the rigging procedure and ground systems checks. The aircraft was dismantled and loaded onto a barge which took it down the Moskva River to Zhukovsky, southeast of Moscow, where the OKB's test facility was located. The bomber was reassembled and readied for its maiden flight on the runway. On the 20th of January 1953, barely 1 year and 10 months after the establishment of Myasishchev's OKB, the M4 prototype took off on its first maiden flight in spite of foul weather. The first flight was brief, involving only a 10-minute circle of the airfield, but it was a major breakthrough for the Soviet aircraft and defense industry. A large crowd gathered to attend the first flight, including some who had hoped to see Myasishchev's new bomber crash. As one might imagine, the flights were not without problems. The first major trouble occurred in the 13th test flight. The mission was nothing out of the ordinary. The aircraft was to make level passes at different altitudes as the maximum speed was being determined. As the bomber accelerated after reaching one of the assigned altitudes, the test engineer sitting in the tail gunner station reported that the inner and outer sections of the elevator were deflecting in opposite directions, which was abnormal. The pilot throttled back and headed back to the airfield. It didn't take long for the engineers to find the cause of the issue and fix it, choosing to simply connect the elevator sections together by riveting metal plates over the joint. A very Soviet solution. After the fixes were completed, the M4 prototype took to the air again. Suddenly, as the aircraft accelerated at 3,000 meters in the air, a loud bang resounded through the airframe, and the bomber started climbing an altitude on its own. At 10,000 meters, it was reported that one elevator had broken away completely, damaging the stabilizer and the rudder as it departed. Throttling back, the pilot ordered the crew to eject, but nobody did. The pilot carefully turned the crippled bomber homeward. After getting down to 2,000 meters, the pilot attempted a simulated flameout and discovered that even with one elevator gone and engine problems, there was still enough elevator authority to control the aircraft. Although this was not the end of their problems. When the runway in Zhukovsky was already in sight, the bomber started acting up again, dropping its nose sharply. It was the pilot's instant reaction and the 5,000-meter runway that saved the test aircraft and the crew. Not caring about the landing speed, the pilot thrust the throttle forward and the nose lifted immediately. Just as the pilot brought the throttle down, the M4 prototype touched down safely. It turned out that the accident had been caused by the designers being too sparse with weight-saving measures. When the first prototype had been assembled, the bomber was terribly overweight. The takeoff weight was more than 180 tons instead of the intended 155 tons. The airframers had then set to work trimming away excess weight wherever they could. As a result, the elevator skin ended up too thin, failing on the 13th flight. The second prototype was completed in December of 1953. Both aircraft completed 147 hours and 15 minutes of flight time between them. The state acceptance trials were held jointly by OKB-23 and the VVS, Soviet Air Force. The greater part of the test program was performed by the VVS test pilots Colonel Sarakin and Major Komarov. Other military pilots flew the M4 at this stage as well. During the same time, Plant No. 3 was preparing for full-scale production of the Myasishchev bomber, which would replace the Tu-4 on the assembly lines. The trials continued until the 5th of August 1954, and the results were not all encouraging. Maximum range flights immediately showed that the range was no more than 6,500 kilometers with a full ordnance load and 9,800 kilometers with only 5 tons of bombs. The first prototypes of the M4 were powered by 4 AMA-3A turbojet engines, as the specifications set by Directive No. 949469 required. It failed to meet the specifications of maximum range with a 5,000 kilogram bomb and cruise altitude in a maximum range flight by a substantial amount. The OKB did not agree with all of the State Commission's finding, arguing that some of the more serious objections were unfounded. Quote, Chief Designer Comrade Myasishchev believes that the VVS incorrectly determined the aircraft's maximum range in the test flight on the 21st of July. He argues that the amount of unusable fuel is actually much smaller than the figure quoted by the Air Force, being 250 kilograms rather than the 1,450 kilograms, and that the amount of fuel required for taxiing after landing was not included in the 5% remaining after landing. As a result, the M4's range ended up being 500 kilometers less than the figure obtained during the manufacturer's flight tests. However, this salesman's talk no longer worked when the actual performance figures of the Tupolev 95 and the M4 had been disclosed, showing the praise for the M4 by its designers was somewhat exaggerated. For example, although the M4 was about 57 kilometers faster than the Tu-95 with the same bomb load, its range in these conditions was 5,000 kilometers shorter. Despite the fact that the M4 fell short of expectations in many regards, the VVS decided to field the new jet bomber anyways, upgrading it in order to obtain the desired performance as soon as they could. This was a political decision aimed at achieving a real advantage in the arms race against the United States. The bottom line was that even though the OKB had managed to design, build, and test fly the new strategic bomber 2 months ahead of schedule, another reason behind the decision to put the M4 into production and service was the Tu-95's development problems and series of crashes. On the 26th of March 1955, the second prototype was transferred to the VVS. However, state acceptance trials were delayed until May 1st because the aircraft was used for conversion training of long-range bomber crews and participated in that year's May Day parade. Full-scale production of the M4 started at the Aircraft Factory No. 23 in 1954. The tremendous efforts of the Soviet aircraft industry bore results. The Soviet Union became the world's first nation to field a new generation strategic bomber as the M4 achieved initial operational capability while the B-52 was still undergoing trials. Moreover, Tupolev's turboprop competitor, the Tu-95, was running behind schedule. The M4 was remarkable in that it was ahead of many aircrafts of simpler design in terms of service entry. According to some sources, Batch 0 comprised of 3 aircraft, 2 prototypes, and a static test airframe. Subsequent production batches consisted of single aircraft each, although it would be more reasonable to say that the M4 had no production batches and that the aircraft were numbered consecutively. As already mentioned, the first prototype had been dismantled and literally shipped to Zhukovsky prior to its maiden flight. However, in order to accelerate the delivery of production bombers, it was desirable to avoid this complicated procedure if at all possible. The problem was that Plant No. 3 possessed only a short runway of no more than 1,500 meters long. The solution was to reduce the bomber's takeoff weight by filling just enough fuel for 1 hour of flight. Myasishchev gave the go-ahead for this experiment, and it worked perfectly. In 1955, Plant 23 started manufacturing M4s powered by RD-3M or RD-3M 500A turbojets, which were advanced versions of the AM-3A. The existing M4 fleet was progressively re-engined by 1957. Besides being more fuel efficient, the RD-3M offered higher thrust, which allowed takeoff to be continued in the event of an engine failure. Originally known simply as the Bison in NATO terms, the initial glass-nose bomber became the Bison A when later upgraded versions were seen. There were many experimental versions and ideas that never progressed from the drawing board. To keep things simple, we'll only go over the models that were accepted. Perhaps in a later video we can go over some of the more interesting experimental versions or other versions, like the nuclear-powered reconnaissance version or the cargo version for carrying parts of spacecraft. In-flight refueling was always lacking in the Soviet Air Force. Fighters and tactical bombers would have to wait for decades to get IFR capabilities, but in the early Cold War, IFR was paramount for nuclear-capable strategic bombers. As I said before, the Soviet Air Force was dissatisfied with the M4's short range, which was only 9,800 kilometers instead of the required 12,000 kilometers. And, unfortunately, Myasishchev could not use the IFR method that already existed. The wingtip-to-wingtip method that was created by Andrei Tupolev and in use with his Tu-4 tankers for the Tu-16. So Myasishchev had to design his own way to fit IFR capabilities into his M4. In collaboration with OKB 918, Myasishchev developed a probe and drogue IFR system for the M4. The tanker's bomb bay was fitted with fuel tanks and a hose drum unit, which consisted of a powered drum with a tilting guide frame and a fuel transfer hose that was 50 meters long with a stabilizing drogue at the end. This assembly was known as the CAS, an acronym that roughly means Self-Contained Refueling Pack. This system was operated by the tail gunner, as he had a great view of the rear of the aircraft. The receiver aircraft featured a long probe tipped with a special adapter on the extreme nose of the aircraft. The probe was telescoping and it was fired pneumatically into the drogue, activating a locking mechanism that also started the fueling process. The first tests of the probe and drogue system began with the M4 in 1955. The second production M4 was converted into a prototype of the tanker version, while the first aircraft was retrofitted with a refueling probe. After a lengthy training period, the test pilots performed the first successful in-flight refueling of an M4 by a sister aircraft. In the course of the manufacturer's test flights, the receiver aircraft made 36 flights, totaling 77 hours and 7 minutes, while the tanker logged 63 hours and 21 minutes in 32 test flights. On the 28th of April 1956, the two aircraft were turned over to the VVS a year later than they were supposed to be. The state acceptance trials began after a further 5-month delay on the 27th of September 1956, but they were halted soon due to numerous technical problems which had to be fixed. Dangerous situations occurred frequently during these trials. There were several cases when the fuel transfer hose would snap. At best, the drogue remained impaled on the probe, and at worst, the remnant of the hose whipped around the horizontal tail, which could damage the elevators and cause loss of control. As two aircraft broke contact, the receiver aircraft would be liberally doused with kerosene remaining in the hose, and the crew wouldn't be able to see for a few moments. Starting in the late 1950s, the M4 bomber fleet was progressively converted for the tanker role, officially designated as the M42. These tankers worked with the newer 3M and Tu-95 bombers. Later, most of the Tu-22 blinder bombers were retrofitted with refueling probes as well, while the Tu-22 M2 Backfire B swing wing medium bombers had them from the beginning. However, these probes were removed from all medium bombers in compliance with the SALT II Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty signed in 1979, which imposed a limit on the bomber's range. By the mid-1950s, it became obvious that the Soviet Air Force would have to field both the M4 and the Tupolev 95 rather than one of them as originally planned. The two bombers complemented each other. While the M4 offered a higher speed and larger bomb load, the Tu-95 possessed longer range. The lack of range for the M4 was mostly due to the poor fuel efficiency of the AM-3A and RD-3M turbojets. OKB-23 had followed the development progress of the VD-7 turbojet since the inception of the Aircraft M bomber project. When the VD-7 commenced its bench testing, Vladimir Myasishchev firmly made up his mind to use this engine for his bombers. As the prototype VD-7s accumulated engine hours on the test beds, and their reliability was being tested, the airframers at OKB-23 started designing new wing root sections and engine bays tailored to place the VD-7s inside. The program was formally launched in 1954 when the Council of Ministers announced a directive ordering the development of an M4 bomber powered by VD-7 turbojets. Just in case the VD-7 did not meet requirements, the VK-9 and AM-13 coupled turbojets were selected as backups since they offered similar performance. Among the proposed change of engines, there were also some other changes For example, the most visible changes were made to the nose of the aircraft. The large glazings were replaced with an extended and more aerodynamic radome. It's a lot easier to show the appearance differences on screen rather than to explain it. The issue of reducing the bomber's structural weight was addressed as well. Operational experience with the M4 made it possible to revise the structural strength standards used in bomber design. The result was weight saving of no less than 6,500 kilograms. As compared to the original M4, the landing gear alone accounted for 1,800 kilograms of saved weight, but the greater part of the saving was distributed between the wing spars and fuel cells and also the lighter engines. Updates were also made to the bomber's systems and equipment, like autopilot systems and better radios, as well as electronic countermeasures and flares. The maximum ordnance load remained unchanged at 24 tons. However, the crew was reduced to 7, and the forward pressure cabin was made a little smaller. The design changes were so extensive that the bomber could justifiably be regarded as a new aircraft. Hence, the Air Force allocated a new service designation of 3M. The prototype 3M was converted from a late production M4 released by the factory in November of 1955. Although flight-cleared VD-7s were still unavailable at that time, reliably functioning VD-7s could be counted on one hand. So the prototype had to be fitted with AM-3A turbojets temporarily to enable the flight tests to begin. The aircraft made its first flight on the 27th of March 1956, and the manufacturer's flight test program continued until January of 1957. In 1956, the factory, which was still manufacturing M4s at the time, gradually started switching to 3M production. The first production aircraft was unique in that it had a mixed power plant, with 2 RD-3Ms portside and 2 VD-7s to starboard. The VD-7s were adjusted to limit their rating so as to avoid any asymmetrical thrust, providing a normal throttle position and coherent flight instrument readings. The third production aircraft, which completed the flight tests in September 1956, was the first 3M to feature the intended power plant of 4 VD-7s. State acceptance trials of the 3M were set to begin on the 30th of January 1957, but it had to be postponed because of persistent problems with the VD-7s, which were prone to surging. The 3M not only entered production, but was actually included in the Soviet Air Force inventory before the state acceptance trials had even started due to the need for the new bomber. Despite the huge amount of test and development work aimed at ironing out the bomber's initial problems, the factory test pilots pointed out that the 3M was quite a handful during takeoff and landing. Although new problems quickly showed and nearly wrecked the 3M's service career before it had even started. Shortly after the completion of state acceptance trials, 2 brand new bombers crashed fatally during pre-delivery test flights. The accidents were identical. As the nose gear bogie tilted during takeoff, the aircraft pitched up sharply, stalling, and crashing immediately after becoming airborne. Again, an investigation panel was hastily put together. Air Force and SAGI representatives went on the offensive, demanding the removal of the new nose gear bogie tilting mechanism which they claimed was responsible for the crashes. The design collective of OKB-23 had a hard time defending their new design. However, the aircraft was eventually cleared completely. What had happened was this. Normally, the nose gear was offloaded as wing lift increased during the takeoff run, and the hydraulic tilt mechanism rotated the bogie, lifting its front wheels off the runway. Later, there was a standing joke among the pilots that all the captain had to do at this moment was sit back, keep the rudder pedals neutral, and wait for payday. However, unable to overcome ingrained habits, some pilots would pull back on the control column to initiate takeoff, just as they would on a normal tricycle gear aircraft. This was the fatal error. The bogie would tilt faster than it should, catapulting the nose up, and the considerable inertia of the heavy forward fuselage would pitch the aircraft up into a super-stalled position, causing a crash. The 3M also had some variations of its own. The 3MS-1 was the standard bomber built with old engines due to shortages, the S meaning old engines. And the 3MN-1 was the standard bomber built with the new VD7 engines, the N means new engines. The 3MS-2 was the standard tanker variant with the old engines, and the 3MN-2 was the standard tanker variant built with the new engines, although these were usually converted to be bombers later. In May of 1958, OKB-23 completed the advanced development project of an aircraft designated M6K. In a missile-armed configuration, it was intended for destroying surface ships, primarily aircraft carrier groups, yet it fully retained the capability to carry free-fall bombs. With the not-too-distant future in mind, the Myasishchev OKB, working together with OKB-52, contemplated development of a weapons system comprising of an aircraft designated 3MD and the P-6 anti-shipping cruise missiles. The missile featured radio communication guidance with a range of 800 kilometers and a top speed of 2,000 kilometers an hour. If the P-6 missile was selected, the aircraft would have to be equipped with a missile guidance system developed by OKB-283. Upon careful consideration, the Myasishchev OKB deemed it more advisable to use the KSR and K-10S missiles designed by OKB-2-155, with minor changes to their systems. The intention was to modify the bomber's Rubin-1 radar as well, turning it into the core of the K-42 guidance system working with the KSR missile, or the K-14 guidance system working with the K-1OS missiles. Concurrently, changes would be made to the aircraft itself. The nose was reshaped again to improve the navigator/bomb aimer's field of view. The radio operator's workstation was moved to the port beam blister, and an inert gas pressurization system was introduced, along with a more effective fire extinguishing system serving the fuel cell bays in the fuselage. The Myasishchev OKB evolved the 3M K-14 strategic weapon system comprising the 3MD bomber armed with two K-10S missiles. With one fuel top-up, the 3MD would be able to attack targets up to 7,000 kilometers away from base, and the missiles would be fired 250 kilometers from the target. The aircraft had full conventional/nuclear bomber capabilities. This versatility was an advantage over the Tu-16K-10 and Tu-95K-20, both of which were dedicated missile carriers. In 1959, the Myasishchev OKB released manufacturing drawings for the modified 3MD bomber/missile carrier. The design changes were kept to a minimum as to ensure a prototype could be completed before the end of the year. After completing aerodynamic calculations for the aircraft in missile carrier configuration, the OKB set up about building a full-scale mock-up, which was completed in December 1959 and readied for presentation. Meanwhile, Plant No. 3 was putting the finishing touches to the first prototype 3MD, and the second prototype was nearing completeness as well. The first prototype was completed in November 1959, making its maiden flight on the 25th of November. A special joint flight test program held by OKB-23 and Factory 23 began the 1st of February 1960. By the 31st of March, the aircraft had made 11 flights totaling 47 hours and 24 minutes. An Air Force test crew flew its first mission on the 3MD in April of 1960. The second prototype 3MD joined the testing in 1960. Meanwhile, development and integration of the K-14S missile continued when a full set of drawings was released and a prototype pylon was manufactured. Towards the end of the year, however, work on this system started winding down because the Myasishchev OKB virtually ceased to exist, being reduced to a division of OKB-52 Missile Design Bureau. Nevertheless, in late 1960 or early 1961, The K-14S missile was attached to a 3MD at the former test airfield and took the first flight with the new missile system. With the changes to the nose of the aircraft, it also got a new reporting name from NATO, the Bison C, and the 3MD was unveiled to the public at the 1967 Moscow Air Show. As I mentioned before, the world became aware of the Soviet Union's new giant jet bomber on the 1st of May 1954, when the first prototype streaked over Moscow's Red Square during the traditional May Day parade, in company with 4 MiG-17s. Heated discussions about the Soviets' new wonder weapon broke out in the Western press. Western experts rightly concluded that the aircraft unveiled on May Day was a high-altitude long-range bomber. The units that operated the M4 included the 1096th and the 1230th Heavy Bomber Regiments. Pretty soon, the M4s and their later 3M descendants started venturing out over international waters. These missions were a show of force, demonstrating the Soviet Union's military power to the west. The Bisons and other Soviet bombers frequently harassed NATO task forces and skirted the maritime borders of NATO nations and Japan. Apart from the harassment, these sorties involved an extremely important photo reconnaissance mission, including nighttime reconnaissance. To this end, the M4 featured a tilting camera mount with AFA-42 day cameras or NAFA-MK night cameras behind the main wheel well. The bomber's main mission was the destruction of key military and industrial ground targets. It should be said that if the bomber was lucky enough to reach its target, the M4 would wipe its target off the map. Standard armament options included 2 special munition, which is a euphemism for nuclear bombs, or 2 9,000 kilogram high explosive bombs, or 4 6,000 kilogram high explosive bombs. The Boeing B-52 entered its flight tests in 1952. A comparison of the initial production B-52 and M4 shows that the two bombers possessed broadly similar performance, except for the service ceiling. The B-52's higher payload-to-weight ratio and takeoff weight also gave it slightly longer range. The American bomber's service ceiling was nearly 5,000 meters higher, which was considered an important advantage for air defense penetration in the 1950s. The only area which the B-52 was inferior was the defensive armament, which initially consisted of only 50 caliber machine guns in the tail. The big question was, could the Bison penetrate air defense systems of the potential adversary NATO nations? The numerous radar stations, surface-to-air missile sites, and supersonic interceptors that had been stationed in Western Europe and North America virtually negated any chance of ever getting through, even in a first strike scenario. The 6 cannons of the M4 barely gave it enough protection. The only hope of the bomber's crew lay in the SPS-2 active jammer, the chaff and flare dispensers, and the armor plating protecting the crew against shell fragments. The service introduction of both the M4 and the 3M was by no means trouble-free, and was accompanied by a good number of accidents, fatal and non-fatal. Accidents occurred during tests and in service. Here are some examples. On the 16th of June, 1955, an M4 was very unlucky. A fuel leak in one of the engine bays caused an in-flight fire. The burning bomber made it back to base but crash-landed 500 meters short of the runway, killing one of the crew. 2 months later, on the 25th of August 1954, an M4 became airborne with a slight right bank after takeoff. The bank steadily grew, reaching 60 to 80 degrees by the time that the aircraft had climbed to about 40 meters, whereupon the Bison side-slipped, crashed, burned, and killed the 7 crew. Pilot error was cited as the cause, but the real reason was the M4's insufficient roll stability at critical angles of attack. On the 23rd of August 1957, an M4 crashed near Omsk in western Siberia, killing the crew of 8. Again, debate raged as the VVS and the aircraft industry hurled accusations at each other. one side claiming the hydraulic control had jammed, and the other side stating pilot error was the cause, but the truth was never established. The upgraded 3M was no better than the M4 from a flight safety standpoint. The first Bison B crashed on the 22nd of November 1957 when the crew attempted to take off with the control gust locks still engaged. There were no survivors. The second major accident occurred on the 14th of February 1958 when the wheel brakes of a 3M overheated during taxiing, causing the hydraulic fluid to catch fire. The fire quickly engulfed the entire aft fuselage and tail unit. Despite all efforts of fire crew, the entire airframe structure aft of the wings burned out before the blaze could be extinguished. In the autumn of 1960, OKB-23 formally ceased to exist as a result of changing government policy towards aviation, yet its designs continued flying and intimidating the Soviet Union's potential adversaries. The 3MSs and 3MNs flew long-range recce missions in international waters on a regular basis, shadowing NATO warships and participating in all manner of military exercises. The notorious shoot-down of Francis Gary Powers' U-2 by an S-75 SAM near Sverdlovsk in 1960 had made it blatantly clear that bombers were no longer safe at high altitudes. The USA quickly devised anti-SAM tactics. From 1962 onwards, they were able to penetrate enemy SAMs at low altitude where the SAMs could not track them. The Soviets responded by a research program that was held to investigate the possibility of maximum range flights for the Tu-95 and 3M bombers at a height of 50 to 200 meters in the daytime when obstacles in terrain were visible, and 200 to 300 meters at night. This low-level penetration tactic significantly increased the chances of air defense penetration by a single aircraft, since flying in formation was ruled out for safety reasons. However, these low-level flights never got further than the experimental stage. Operational use of this tactic required the aircraft to be modified in order to withstand turbulence at the low altitude. Gradually, the Bison was replaced by newer types of bombers. Sometimes, however, the trend was reversed. For instance, during the Soviet-Afghan War, when the Soviet Air Force was tasked with suppressing resistance of Mujahideen rebels with conventional bombs to pave way for Soviet troops, the 3Ms of the 1096th and 1230th Heavy Bomber Regiments, based at the Engels II Air Force Base, were also prepared for the mission along with other types. The tankers had to be temporarily reconverted to bombers by replacing the refueling equipment with cassette racks for 52 250 kilogram bombs or 28 500 kilogram bombs. The last crash of a Bison occurred on the 16th of May 1992 when two 3MS tankers collided in midair near Saratov en route from Engels to Semipalatinsk. Both aircraft exploded, and only 2 of the 14 people on board the two jets survived. The last 3 MDs soldiered on until mid-1994, when the units at Engels had mastered the new Tu-160 Blackjack supersonic bombers. The final sortie took place on the 23rd of March, 1994. In August of 1997, the remaining aircraft were ferried to a designated area for disposal. 2 Bisons survive today. A 3MS-2 is preserved at the Air Force Museum in Diaghilevo, while a 3MD resides at the Central Russian Air Force Museum in Monino, south of Moscow. Well, eventually everything must come to an end. When Myasishchev's M4s first took to the skies in 1954, they shocked the world and intimidated their Western adversaries. And by the time of the mid-90s, they were nothing but dilapidated wrecks waiting to be scrapped. But they performed their job, and for quite a long time, with a total service life of about 40 years. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any other aircraft you'd like to see featured, please let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and goodbye.